that's not my theme. No. No, I did not go with purple. No. Let me try this again. Oh, it's on. There you go. That's better.
Magic touch.
Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker for this session is Osama Atla from University of Bristol. And this is also a paper that was selected to be a best paper for the session. So congratulations to you and your co-authors.
Thanks, yeah. Thank you for coming. This paper, we reflect and explore how voice user interfaces could be introduced in mainstream schools to improve the inclusion of visually impaired and sighted children. So by voice user interfaces, we are referring to specifically to off-the-shelf devices like the Amazon Echo or Google Home. These are becoming increasingly popular, and they are driving the resurgence of interest in research on voice interaction and voice interfaces. Sorry, but mostly in homes. There's been much less research that looks at how these tools could be introduced in other contexts, like in schools. So we wanted to look at voice interfaces in inclusive schools. So these are schools that are mainstream rather than special schools. They aspire to, they encourage diversity, provide equal learning opportunities for different students, and particularly for disabled and non-disabled children. So in our case, we worked with an inclusive school that has visually impaired children learn alongside their sighted peers. So we wanted to look specifically at 3 questions. So we wanted to first explore what are the challenges to inclusion in these schools, and how could VUIs address them. And we were interested in what pupils themselves think about these challenges to inclusion, and how to address them through voice interaction. And also we were interested in the question of how we might co-design voice user interfaces with groups who have mixed visual abilities. So to do this, we had a focus group discussion with experts in teaching visual impairment. We had a bodystorming activity with a class of pupils and their teacher. And we ran some co-design workshops with visually impaired sighted teachers and their sighted pupils and their teachers. So the main contribution of this paper is an initial design space of thinking about how we might introduce voices interfaces and how it could intervene to support inclusive education. So what I want to do in this talk is essentially just go through these activities and show some examples of how this contributed to the articulation of this initial design space. Yeah, so we started with the focus group discussion. So what we wanted to understand is what barriers to inclusions are there that are specific to visually impaired children. So we met with groups of experts in inclusive education for children. So there were 2 groups. One group were qualified teachers of visual impairments. These are employed by local governments here in the UK, and they support families and work with schools to support to follow children through their education and support them. And the other group was from a local school. So this was made up of teachers, teaching assistants, and the the special education needs coordinator of the school. So in both cases, we met and had open discussions about challenges to inclusion and how voice might play into this. So throughout the work, in all these activities, we always use thematic analysis as a method to look into our data. We use an inductive approach. So that's what we did with the transcript of interviews, of the discussion, the focus group discussions here. So we found 5 main challenges to inclusion. There's issues related to academic stimulation, to technological isolation, to learning pace, to taking notes and revising from notes, and to independent mobility. Obviously, I won't have time to go through most of them, so I'll mention 2 of them. I'll start with pace of learning. So a visually impaired child experiences voice in interesting ways in a classroom. So there are usually about 4 distinct forms. So there's the voice of the teacher that's coming from one side of the classroom. There's the voice of the peers. There's the voice of a teaching assistant. Here in the UK, every visually impaired child has a teaching assistant who sits with them to help them and give them descriptions and whatnot. And then for some visually impaired pupils, they would have voice coming through their earpiece from a screen reader, so the speech display of that screen reader. So one interesting issue is that this makes it a bit difficult to keep up with the pace of the lesson. So one suggestion that came up from the discussion is to introduce some kind of voice-based activity for the whole class at different points in the lesson, like a quiz or Q&As, and this would allow essentially for moments of common mediation, or almost like anchor points where the visually impaired people could join in and also realign themselves with the pace of the lesson. But our participants also thought that the teachers could use this anchor points or these moments to also gauge pupils' understandings of a particular subject matter they learn at that point by reflecting on the kind of questions they use to engage with the voice interface. So it was, in a sense, they also thought about some form of inclusive pedagogy in this sense. Right. Sorry, my slides are not synced well. Anyway. Yeah, so another interesting challenge was to do with mobility. So participants mentioned that typically visually impaired pupils are trained to learn how to move in the school on specific routes. And they typically tend to stick to those routes, especially when they first come into a school. And this has basically reduces opportunities for social encounters. So they suggested that most visually impaired pupils would have a smartphone with them that they could use outside the classroom, so we could design applications that are specific to both their navigation needs and their social needs. So they emphasize here that the application should do more than provide instructions, navigation instructions, or ways to navigate effectively from A to B to avoid obstacles and so on, but also to include information about social opportunities, about knowing about who's around, what kind of activities are ongoing, and so on and so forth, that the visually impaired child could then explore in a free and unstructured way. So we could start to see some important properties to consider for our design space. First, there was a question of who owns the VUI device, or the VUI application at the time of use, whether this is a device for the whole class, for a small group, or for an individual at a particular time. There was also a question of mobility. Is this going to be used on the move or statically? And there were also interesting ways of thinking about type of learning that's being supported. So in the particular example that came up, it was a type of reflective learning that was supported by the VUI to gauge pupils' understanding. Oh yeah, I wanted to note very quickly that this kind of sets of themes fits nicely with our CHI paper last year, so that corroborates our finding from last year. So if you're interested in learning more about barriers to inclusion for visual impairment in mainstream schools, I would suggest you read both papers. There was a nice match between the two. So having identified challenges for inclusive from the point of view of the experts, we wanted to engage pupils and gain their perspectives. So instead of going for a focus group discussion, we opted for doing a bodystorming session. So we worked with a class of 27 pupils that had one visually impaired child, and we worked with the science and the drama teacher to organize a lesson simulation. So we had a lesson simulation for a bit, where the drama teacher played the role of the science teacher. We had moments where pupils shared their learning aids, so the props that both sighted and visually impaired kids used as part of the chemistry class. And we also had them simulate mobility of getting to and from the chemistry lab inside the school. And then we had some group discussions, and the pupils produced some notes. They just wrote down ideas of challenges and potential solutions that they have. So we analyzed both this data and our notes of these sessions. So from the pupils' perspective, there were three broad categories of challenges. They picked up on the graphics used in the lesson, but these were inaccessible. But they also picked up on graphics around the classroom. Like, for example, in the chemistry lab, there's the table of elements hang that they could refer to during the lesson. But there are also some nice decorations that just made the classroom nicer and prettier. And there was something that they called silent hazards. So they picked up on the fact that it's difficult to pick up on the status of lab equipment. So, for example, whether the cast tab is on or off. And also missing out on boards where there's flyers for social events and activities in the corridors. So in terms of ideas, they thought about voice application that they could support both individual spaces and group spaces. So and they wanted control over the personality of the voice assistant. So They said, for example, that the voice assistant could individually could have an encouraging tone if they detected that the child is struggling with revising or with note-taking, or it could have an authoritative tone if in a group space, if it detected that a group is veering off topic when they're revising together, for instance. So the outcomes here both confirm some of the initial properties in the design space, but also extend it by thinking about different kinds of types of learning. So here we're looking at revision, so applied-based or fact-based learning, and further introduce this idea of space that are quite distinct from ownership. So where does the voice user interface is used? Is it in the library? Is it in the corridor? Is it on the clothes of a pupil, and so on? So having learned about both the perspective of the experts and the pupils, we wanted to do some co-design activities with visually impaired and sighted participants. And the motivation here is to both co-design an actual voice-based application that maybe addresses some of the challenges that we identified, but also to explore how we might do this with a group of mixed participants with mixed visual abilities. So we worked with 4 participants, 2 pupils, 1 sighted, 1 visually impaired, a teaching assistant, and a special education need coordinator of the school. So we spent the first workshop just familiarizing them with the technology. We used an Amazon Echo, and we decided on what scenario to focus on. They wanted to focus on peer revision and to also have this in a form of a quiz or a game. In the second workshop, we started designing the structure of this game in terms of, well, its structure, its gameplay, the way you keep score, the way you generate revision material or share material, and so on. And we used Lego construction and Wizard of Oz as a way to do lo-fi prototyping here. And then in the third workshop, we actually created an Alexa skill that captures those design ideas, and we brought it with us to the school. So we explored it and thought about and reflected about how it might be improved and so on. So here we moved from low fidelity to hi-fi prototyping. So there was 3 general themes or outcomes of this. Participants talked about there were issues to do with how we would engage with Alexa. So at the time of this research, there was a lot of compounded commands for Alexa. So if you want to engage with the game, you'd have to hail Alexa, then hail the skill, then do the command for whatever command it is at the game. So our participants had some interesting ideas of how to address this. Continuous listening mode might be an option, but we quickly discovered that it's not really good in a context of revising because the kids are engaged in conversation. This can trigger false invocations. So instead, they thought of using physical controllers, like a big button where you can just use it as quick shortcuts for hailing Alexa or other shortcuts within the gameplay. And then this quickly turned into thinking about game controllers because they're familiar with them. They could do very complex commands, and they could use that to play much effectively. And they also thought about using other interesting sensory modalities, like audio might not provide too much privacy when you're playing a game. Your opponent might find out by your answers and so on, so you could use other modalities like vibration, or maybe use smell as an incentive for reflecting scores. So high score is a pleasant smell, a low score is not just a pleasant smell. We explored a little bit the idea of using wearables for invoking, so maybe wearing things that you can tap, and then that could be used as shortcuts for hailing Alexa and so on, but they didn't like that. In particular, the visually impaired participants thought that other people might reach out to your hand and they didn't like to be startled, and this was seen as an invasion of private space. So using insights from these design sessions, we designed what we call the Voctopus application. So this is an augmentation of the Amazon Echo with the physical controllers. So 3 people can play a game to revise together. It has some multisensory feedback like audio and vibration. And we're at the moment working on extending that while introducing other sensory modalities, so smell, and also deploying this in school for long-term evaluation. But what's interesting as far as the design space is concerned is that there was a lot of emphasis on adding physicality, multisensory interaction to the voice interface. This turned out to be quite interesting. So we need to think about whether the interacting through voice is going to be unimodal. So is this just going to be voice only? Or should we consider other sensory modalities to engage in much more playful and interesting multisensory learning experiences? So put together, this design space is just an initial effort to try and map out important aspects to consider when designing voice interaction for inclusive education, and that was produced by engaging closely with teachers, educators, and children with and without visual impairments. So it can be used, for example, by designers of assistive technology to reflect on their designs and think about how to improve them and so on. So if we take the Voxtopus, for instance, we could reflect that this is a collectively owned application that is to be used statically in a private space to support applied learning through multisensory interaction. And of course, as an initial space, there is still plenty of room for it to be extended in order to consider other aspects of inclusion. So the design space itself highlights the areas that we could explore. So this has to do with novel forms of voice. How does it morph when we tweak some of the properties? How does the Voxtopus morph and be played on the move, or be played in the library, or be played in the corridor? But there are also other issues to consider in terms of, say, control, for instance. To what extent we can introduce voice interactions while at the same time allowing teachers to maintain control over the classroom without compromising inclusion in this case. And there are obviously other, as we've seen from other talks, important issues to do with ethics, to do with security, and to do with privacy. So to quickly summarize, I think we found that there is actually potential that voice interaction could lead to more inclusive learning experiences, but it's important, we feel, that this has to start from essentially breaking voice out from this kind of confines of screen readers and of human assistance and descriptions, and shifting focus away from providing a functional form of accessibility towards more sort of supporting of inclusive and social connections between pupils themselves and between pupils and teachers and other staff. This is just wanted to end with the reflections that our design space is an initial design space, but it's also the results of reflecting on the challenges of inclusions, and there is a need to enrich it and extend it by looking at, in practice, essentially, once we deploy this sort of voice interactions in schools, as we're trying to do at the moment, hopefully we'll have additional insights to enrich this design space. And I think I'll end with that. I have a few seconds to say that we are hiring. We have 1 postdoc and 1 PhD students, and the Bristol Interaction Group is a great group to work in. So thank you for listening.